There are moments in life when everything quietly falls apart, not with noise or drama, but with silence. The kind of silence that sits beside you at night and asks questions you don't know how to answer. This is a story about one of those moments, a story that reveals why suffering is not the enemy we believe it to be, and why healing begins the moment we loosen our grip on what we can no longer carry. In a quiet mountain town far from ambition and applause, there lived a man named Elias Rowan. He was known for his discipline, his calm presence, and the way he rarely spoke unless necessary. But beneath his composed exterior was a weight he had never learned to release, and that weight would change everything. Elias Rowan woke before the sun, not because he needed to, but because his body no longer trusted rest. The room around him was small and orderly. A narrow bed, a wooden table, a single window facing the mountains, everything in its place. Nothing excessive, nothing unnecessary. He had built his life that way on purpose. Each morning followed the same rhythm. He folded his blanket with care, washed his face in cold water, sat in silence while the world outside slowly breathed itself awake. To an outsider, it looked like discipline, like peace, like a man who had mastered himself. But discipline, when taken too far, can become a hiding place. Elias carried himself like someone who believed control was the same as strength. His movements were measured. His words were few. In the monastery where he lived, people respected him. Some admired him. Others felt calmed just by his presence. They said he had the stillness of someone who had made peace with life. What they didn't see was what he carried inside. There was a memory Elias returned to every day without realizing it. Not intentionally, not consciously. It lived in the pauses between his breaths, in the tightness of his chest when the evenings grew quiet, in the way his eyes lingered too long on moments that had already passed. It was the memory of a life that no longer existed. Years ago, before the mountain paths and the quiet robes, Elias had loved deeply. He had believed in a future shaped by shared mornings, shared burdens, shared dreams. And when that future disappeared, suddenly, painfully, he did what he knew how to do. He endured. He did not scream. He did not beg. He did not collapse. Instead, he tightened his grip on routine, on discipline, on silence. He convinced himself that strength meant not needing anything, that healing meant never looking back, that letting go meant forgetting. But letting go is not forgetting, and endurance is not healing. Every step Elias took through the stone corridors echoed with restraint. Every breath was controlled, every emotion filtered before it could rise too high. The past was locked away, not released, but imprisoned. And like all imprisoned things, it pushed back. At night, when the monastery slept, Elias would sit alone and feel the weight press against him. Not sharp pain, not dramatic sorrow, just a steady heaviness. The kind that doesn't scream for attention but slowly bends the spine. He believed this weight was the price of being strong. He believed suffering was something to carry quietly. He believed that if he held on long enough, it would eventually disappear. But suffering does not disappear when ignored. It waits. And Elias Rowan, calm and disciplined and admired, was walking forward every day, while unknowingly dragging the past behind him. He had not yet learned the truth that would change everything. Some weights are not meant to be carried. They are meant to be set down. Discipline gave Elias Rowan something grief never could: structure. And in structure he found relief. His days became precise, measured, predictable. He rose before dawn, worked in silence, studied ancient texts not for answers but for order. Each action flowed into the next like stones laid carefully across a river. Step by step, he told himself, this is how you cross pain. And for a while it worked. There was comfort in repetition, comfort in knowing exactly what the day would ask of him and what it would not. The world outside the monastery was loud and uncertain, but inside these walls everything obeyed rules. Bells rang on time, meals were simple, words were few. Discipline wrapped around Elias like armor. People began to notice. They saw how steady he was, how rarely he wavered. When others struggled with doubt or distraction, Elias remained consistent. When emotions ran high, his stayed low. He became someone others quietly looked up to, not because he spoke wisdom, but because he seemed untouched by chaos. This, Elias thought, was what strength looked like. Each small victory reinforced the belief. A day without break in routine, a night without tears, a week without the past resurfacing too loudly. He mistook numbness for peace. The flaw was subtle, almost invisible. Discipline had stopped being a tool. It had become a wall. Elias used effort to outrun emotion, used control to avoid vulnerability. He didn't allow himself moments of weakness because weakness felt dangerous. It reminded him of the life he lost, the version of himself that had hoped freely and loved openly. So he replaced feeling with doing. When pain surfaced, he worked harder. When memories returned, he tightened his schedule. When loneliness whispered, he called it distraction and buried it under duty. And the world rewarded him for it. Others praised his commitment, his calm, his apparent peace. No one questioned whether discipline was helping him heal or simply helping him hide. Not even Elias questioned it himself, because asking that question would require stillness without structure, and that terrified him. Deep down, he feared that without routine, everything he had buried would rise at once, that without discipline, the weight would crush him. So he kept moving, kept controlling, kept holding on. What Elias didn't realize was that discipline, when driven by fear, slowly becomes a cage, a beautiful one, a respected one, but a cage nonetheless. Success, as he defined it, was simple. Never fall apart again. Never need anyone again. Never feel that kind of loss again. And so the rise continued. But every rise built on avoidance carries the seed of collapse. And Elias Rowan was climbing higher, without noticing how fragile the ground beneath him truly was. The breaking point did not arrive like a storm, it came like a crack in stone, quiet, sudden, irreversible. One afternoon, Elias Rowan was assigned a simple task: to accompany an elder monk down the mountain path to a nearby village. Nothing difficult, nothing demanding. He had walked that path hundreds of times before. The rhythm of it was familiar, predictable, until it wasn't. Halfway down the trail, the elder slipped, not dramatically, just enough. A misstep, a breath too late. Elias reached out on instinct, but instinct was not fast enough. The man fell, striking the ground below with a sound that echoed far longer than it should have. The silence that followed was unbearable. Elias knelt beside him, hand steady, breath controlled, discipline still intact. He did everything he was trained to do, everything he was supposed to do, but by the time help arrived, it was already over. Loss had found him again. This time there was no past to blame, no old wound to reopen. This was new, immediate, unavoidable. And for the first time since his retreat into discipline, Elias felt something he could not contain: helplessness. The monastery mourned. Rituals were observed. Words were spoken. Candles were lit. Others wept openly, honestly, without restraint. Elias stood among them, composed as ever, head bowed, hands folded, silent. Everyone assumed he was strong, but inside him, something fractured. He replayed the moment endlessly: the timing, the distance, the angle of his reach. If he had been faster, if he had been closer, if he had done something, anything differently. Discipline had no answer for this. There was no routine that could undo the fall, no effort that could rewrite the moment, no control that could save someone already gone. And the realization struck him with brutal clarity: he could not outwork grief. That night, Elias did not sleep. The weight he had been carrying for years collided with a new one. Old loss and fresh guilt intertwined, tightening around his chest. For the first time, the structure he depended on felt hollow. The walls he had built felt thin. He sat in his room as the hours passed, staring at the same wooden floor, unable to move forward or back. This failure was different. It wasn't personal ambition collapsing. It wasn't a dream fading. It was the shattering of his belief that discipline could protect him from pain. And when that belief broke, everything else began to follow. Elias had spent years training himself to endure suffering quietly, but now suffering refused to stay quiet. It pressed closer, louder, heavier, and in that stillness, with nothing left to control, Elias Rowan faced a truth he had avoided for far too long. Strength alone does not save you, and sometimes doing everything right still ends in loss. After the fall, time lost its shape. Days passed, marked by bells and meals and familiar rituals, but Elias Rowan moved through them as though he were already a memory. His body followed the routine. His hands performed the motions, but his mind was no longer present. It was trapped in a single moment on the mountain path. He replayed it endlessly, not as grief, but as negotiation. If I had taken the lead instead of walking behind, if I had insisted on a slower pace, if I had noticed the loose stone sooner, the past became something Elias believed he could still correct, if only he thought about it long enough. Letting go felt impossible, not because he didn't understand it, but because it felt like surrender. And surrender to him meant admitting that the loss was final, that the guilt had nowhere to go, that the weight was his to live with forever. So he held on. He returned to the path alone, walking it again and again as if repetition could soften the outcome. He adjusted his steps, changed his pace, practiced reaching out at different moments, training for a moment that would never come again. The mountain did not respond. Inside the monastery, Elias tightened his discipline further. He woke earlier, spoke even less, ate only what was necessary, as if reducing himself could balance the loss of another. This wasn't healing, it was penance. Others noticed the change. The calm that once felt grounded now felt hollow. His silence, once peaceful, had turned heavy, but no one intervened. Elias was respected, trusted, strong, and strong people everyone believed could handle their own suffering. At night, guilt sat beside him like an unwelcome companion. It asked questions without answers, accused him without evidence, and Elias listened to every word. He told himself that holding on was responsibility, that forgetting would be disrespect, that moving forward meant abandoning the dead. so he stayed exactly where he was, emotionally frozen in the past. The irony was cruel. The more he clung to the memory, the further he drifted from the life he was still living, from the breath still moving through him, from the people still present. Suffering had become familiar, predictable, almost safe, because as long as he held on, he didn't have to face the terrifying truth that life moves forward without asking permission. That some losses are not lessons, they are simply losses. Elias Rowan believed he was honoring the past by refusing to release it. He didn't yet see that he was slowly disappearing with it. Silence became Elias Rowan's closest companion. Not the peaceful kind he once cherished, but a dense, pressing quiet that followed him everywhere. It sat beside him during meals he barely tasted. It stood behind him during prayers that felt empty. It waited for him at night, patient and unyielding. He stopped joining others unless required, not out of bitterness, out of exhaustion. Conversation demanded presence, and presence required energy he no longer had. The monastery still moved around him, gentle, alive, breathing. But Elias felt detached from it, as though separated by glass. He could see life happening, but he was no longer part of it. The discipline that once anchored him now felt mechanical. Hollow motions performed by someone who had forgotten why they began. He wasn't in pain the way people imagine pain. There were no tears, no dramatic breakdowns. There was just emptiness, a slow erosion of meaning. Elias would sit for long stretches, staring at nothing in particular, listening to the sound of his own breath. In those moments, he felt strangely light and unbearably heavy at the same time, as if something essential had left him, but its absence still occupied space. This was the lowest point, not because something terrible happened, but because nothing seemed to matter anymore. He questioned everything he had believed. Was discipline strength or avoidance? Was silence wisdom or fear? Had he chosen this life to grow or to disappear quietly? There were moments when he wondered if this numbness was the end of the journey, if this muted existence was all that remained once hope was stripped away. The thought didn't scare him as much as it should have. That frightened him most. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, Elias remained seated long after the others had left. The hall was empty, the air cool. For the first time in years, he felt no urge to stand, to correct his posture, to follow the schedule. He simply stayed. And in that stillness, without routine, without effort, without discipline, something unfamiliar surfaced. Not pain, not guilt, longing. A quiet desire to feel alive again, to feel connected, to feel something beyond endurance. It startled him. Elias realized then that he had been surviving, not living, carrying suffering like proof of strength, when all it had done was drain him of joy, of presence, of purpose. The silence pressed in, but for the first time he didn't fight it. He let it speak. And what it revealed was simple and devastating. He could not heal by isolating himself from life. He could not think his way out of grief, and he could not carry this weight forever. This was the moment before change became possible. The moment when resistance finally grew tired. Elias Rowan did not yet know how to let go, but for the first time, he understood that holding on was costing him everything. The encounter did not feel important at first. There was no ceremony, no announcement, no moment that demanded attention. It happened on an ordinary morning, the kind Elias Rowan had lived through countless times before. He was sent to the edge of the grounds to repair a weathered fence. Simple work, physical, silent. The kind of task that usually allowed his mind to drift safely into routine. But that morning, someone was already there. An old man sat on a fallen log nearby, watching the mountains as if they were old friends. His clothes were plain, his posture relaxed. He did not look like someone waiting for anything. He simply was. Elias nodded politely and continued his work. Minutes passed. Only the sound of wood and wind filled the air. Then, without turning his head, the old man spoke. "You carry it like it will disappear if you hold it long enough." The words landed gently, but precisely. Elias froze. The man finally looked at him. His eyes were calm, curious, unburdened, not accusing, not sympathetic, just present. Elias felt the familiar urge to retreat, to explain, to justify, to stay silent. But something in the man's stillness made that unnecessary. "I don't know how to put it down," Elias said quietly. The old man smiled, not kindly, not sadly, simply knowingly. "Most people don't," he replied. "They think letting go means losing it. But letting go is just stopping the fight." They sat in silence again. The mountains remained unchanged. The wind moved as it always had. Nothing dramatic occurred, and yet Elias felt something shift, not inside his thoughts, but beneath them. "You don't honor the past by suffering forever," the man continued. "You honor it by living well." Elias swallowed. The truth of it struck harder than any accusation could have. Before Elias could respond, the man stood, brushed the dust from his clothes, and began walking down the path. "Pain stays," he said over his shoulder, "but it doesn't need to be carried." Then he was gone. Elias remained by the fence, hands resting on the wood, heart beating just a little faster than before. The encounter had offered no instructions, no solution, no discipline to follow, only permission. Permission to release, permission to breathe, permission to stop confusing suffering with loyalty. For the first time in a long while, Elias felt something unfamiliar rise within him, not certainty, but possibility. Letting go did not happen all at once. Elias Rowan woke the next morning expecting clarity, expecting relief, expecting the weight to be gone. Instead, it was still there, familiar, heavy, unchanged. For a brief moment, disappointment flickered through him. Then he remembered the old man's words. "Pain stays, but it doesn't need to be carried." So Elias began differently, not by removing the pain, but by loosening his grip. He allowed himself to slow down, not in his duties, but in his resistance. When memories surfaced, he didn't push them away. He didn't analyze them or punish himself for feeling them. He simply noticed them, like clouds passing across the sky. Some days were easier, others felt unbearable. But something subtle had shifted. He was no longer fighting himself. For the first time, Elias allowed emotion without judgment. Sadness arrived, and he did not call it weakness. Guilt appeared, and he did not bow to it. He learned to sit with discomfort without turning it into identity. This was humility. He realized how much energy he had spent proving his strength, to others, to himself, to the past, and how little energy he had spent actually healing. Letting go meant accepting that the fall on the mountain would never make sense, that no perfect version of events existed where loss did not occur. It meant releasing the belief that suffering was payment owed. Some evenings, Elias would walk the ground slowly, feeling the earth beneath his feet, breathing without control, allowing silence without armor. These moments did not erase the pain, but they softened it. He began to feel again, not just sorrow, but warmth, gratitude, even brief moments of peace. They frightened him at first. Peace felt undeserved, but over time he understood. Peace is not a reward for suffering long enough. It is a state that arrives when we stop resisting reality. Elias was still disciplined, still committed, but now discipline served life, not avoidance. It became a container for healing rather than a shield against feeling. The weight he carried did not vanish. It simply grew lighter because he was no longer lifting it alone. This was not the end of the journey. It was the beginning of living again. Just when Elias Rowan began to trust the lightness, the past tested him. Healing had made space, and into that space, old habits quietly returned. The urge to control, the instinct to retreat, the familiar voice that whispered, "You're slipping. You're getting careless. Don't forget what pain costs." One evening, Elias found himself standing at the edge of the mountain path again. Not intentionally. His feet had carried him there on their own, as if muscle memory remembered before the mind could intervene. The air was still, the ground unchanged. For a moment, everything rushed back. The fall, the sound, the instant when time fractured. His chest tightened, his breath shortened. The weight surged, not as memory, but as identity. The old version of himself offered comfort through rigidity. Return to discipline. Shut this down. Go numb again. Elias almost listened. That was the real test, not suffering, but choice. He stood there for a long time, feeling the pull of who he had been and the quiet call of who he was becoming. Letting go, he realized, was not a one-time decision. It was something life asked of him again and again. Slowly, deliberately, Elias exhaled. He did not replay the moment. He did not correct the past. He did not punish himself. He acknowledged it and stepped back. The ground did not swallow him. The pain did not destroy him. The world continued to exist without demanding his collapse. That night, Elias returned to his room and followed his routine, not out of fear, but intention, discipline, reclaimed, not as a cage, but as support. Strength, he learned, is not measured by how little we feel. It is measured by how consistently we choose healing over avoidance. Old thoughts would return again in the future. He knew that now, but they no longer defined him. They were visitors, not rulers. Transformation was proving itself not in moments of clarity, but in moments of temptation. And Elias Rowan was learning how to stay. Peace arrived quietly, not as joy, not as triumph, but as absence. The absence of constant tension, the absence of resistance, the absence of the need to explain himself, to the past or to anyone else. Elias Rowan began to notice the change in small ways. His breath no longer felt guarded. His shoulders rested where they once braced. Mornings came without dread. Evenings ended without the familiar heaviness pressing against his chest. Life had not become easier. It had become lighter. He understood now that purpose was not something to be found or achieved. It was something that emerged when he stopped trying to control every outcome. When he allowed himself to exist fully in the present moment, without dragging yesterday behind him. Elias spoke more. Not much, but honestly. He listened without preparing answers. He laughed once, unexpectedly, and felt no guilt for it. That surprised him most. Peace did not mean forgetting. It meant no longer gripping memory like a weapon. The mountain paths remained. The monastery remained. But Elias moved through them differently now. No longer as someone trying to disappear into discipline, but as someone choosing to be alive. He had lost, he had failed, and yet he remained. That was the gift suffering had hidden all along. When pain stopped being something to fight, it became something to learn from. When he released the need to carry it forever, it returned to what it truly was. A part of his story, not the whole of it. Elias did not possess peace. He allowed it, and in that allowance, life quietly opened again. If you are listening to this story, there is a chance you are carrying something too. Not loudly, not visibly, but faithfully. Like Elias Rowan, you may have learned how to endure, how to stay composed, how to keep moving even when something inside you broke a long time ago. The world may even admire you for it, but endurance is not the same as healing. Suffering teaches us many things, if we are willing to listen instead of resist. It teaches us that strength is not proven by how much pain we can hold, but by how honestly we can face it. It reminds us that discipline is meant to support life, not replace it. That silence can be wise, but isolation slowly erases us. You do not honor the past by staying trapped in it. You honor it by allowing yourself to live fully now. Letting go does not mean what happened didn't matter. It means you matter too. Pain will visit you again. Old memories will knock. Old habits will whisper familiar promises of control and numbness. This is not failure. This is being human. Healing is not a straight line. It is a practice. A choice made repeatedly, often quietly, without witnesses. You are allowed to feel without collapsing. You are allowed to move forward without betrayal. You are allowed to set down what was never meant to be carried forever. Like Elias, you may never get answers that satisfy the mind. Some losses will remain unfair. Some endings will never feel complete. But peace does not come from resolution. It comes from acceptance. And acceptance does not weaken you. It frees you. So if you are in a season of heaviness, take this with you. You do not need to disappear to survive. You do not need to suffer endlessly to prove your worth. And you do not need to be healed to begin living again. Start small. Breathe honestly. Loosen your grip. Just a little. That is how rebirth begins. And if this story spoke to something inside you, if it gave language to a feeling you've been carrying quietly, then stay connected. Like, share, subscribe. Not for noise, but for reminder. You are not alone on this journey, and you were never meant to walk it weighed down forever.